Hello, I'm Dimiaki Mokalieli. This is In Focus. We're going to start the show today by going directly to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where leaders of 20 of the world's leading rich and developing countries are meeting for a second day at the G20 Summit. With them, my colleague, Vincent Makori. Hey, Vincent Makori, how are you today?
I'm fine, Dimi. How are you?
Very well. Even though it's just the second day of the summit, already major developments that the G20 will now officially replace the G8. Can you expound on that?
Exactly. It was observed that the G8 has been ineffective over the years, and now the need for expanded representation of the world in dealing with the world economic situation. And so officially the G20 takes over what used to be the issues and responsibilities of the G8. And so we are talking fairly expanded kind of representation, but a few people are not happy still because they feel there are more than 190 countries that are not represented effectively.
And Makori, while you've been out there, you've been, of course, going around Pittsburgh, seeing some of the developments. Tell us about what you've observed.
Well, there have been a lot of activity around Pittsburgh, particularly groups of demonstrators making their messages heard, hopefully barricaded, of course, outside of the area where the leaders are meeting. And I went around the streets and I want to share with you what I observed.
G20, inviting, Allah coming out.
Among the protesters that flocked Pittsburgh was this group of Ethiopians. They are opposed to the invitation of the Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi to the G20 summit.
He is a very, very brutal dictator. It is a face for the Ethiopians and the rest of Africa, but represented by Zenawi. So we are here to oppose Zenawi. He is a dictator. He never been elected. Everybody knows he stole the whole election. He's killing so many people every year, every day. So this is shame him to represent Africa. So we're telling the G20 people they are really underestimating Africa.
Mr. Zenawi is representing the African Union's development initiative, NEPAD. Security is tight in Pittsburgh, a cause of much frustration to the thousands of protesters. Still, they are making their voices heard. Activists say the G20 must move beyond rhetoric and fulfill their commitments to the developing countries. Privilege Hangandu is from Zambia's Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection.
I think first and foremost would like to hear the G20 reaffirm the promises that they made in April this year in London, and would like them to honestly evaluate themselves. How much have they done vis-a-vis what they promised in April?
Kumi Naidu is a South African climate change advocate.
On climate change, we want to have a clear commitment that the G20, as the most powerful countries in the world, will deliver a fair, ambitious and binding treaty in Copenhagen. By fair, we mean one that recognizes that poor countries have been least responsible for the climate catastrophe that we find ourselves in, and therefore they should be provided with the generous support to help them adapt to the devastation of climate change, given that even though they were least responsible, they are the ones that are paying the first price and the most painful price already.
Amira Woods of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. wants to hear the issue of combating poverty given prominence.
Close to 100 million people facing extreme poverty by the end of 2009. You have high unemployment rates throughout the African world. Clearly, something needs to be done. The rules of the game have got to change so that it benefits people and protects the planet.
As the G20 summit concludes today, many are looking forward with the hope that this time around, words will be translated into concrete actions. Vincent Makori at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh.
Mr. Makori, great job. You really captured, some of the essence, of course, of what is very typical at a lot of these kind of summits, these protesters. What are your observations about the effectiveness of these protesters, especially when you see the Ethiopian community there protesting against Mr. Meles Zenawi's presence?
Yeah, in fact, what you can say is that they're playing to the media because essentially the presidents are not anywhere closer to where they're going to look and read some of these posters or listen to some of these protesters, but they're hoping that the media picks up on this report and the leaders can get to hear about what these people want to hear or want to tell them. As for effectiveness, it's a question of much later assessment of how well their messages went across. But as you can see, there are all sorts of people here, and as Emira Woods in that package says, the rules of the game have to change. This is exactly what they want to communicate to the G20 leaders here.
Makori, were you surprised at the representation of Africans there? I mean, you already talked to a South African, a Zambian, a Liberian, Emira Woods, and Ethiopians. That's quite a large grouping.
It's a large grouping. Africans feel they have a stake in this, and that's why actually they're asking for an expanded representation. The issues that affect them are the ones that ought to be discussed here, they feel, because Africa is facing the brunt of poverty, of climate change, and they feel that there is a need to have more focus on Africa, to have more representation. And so it is not just a gathering of the wealthy nations discussing about how to recover or to help the economy recover from a recession or from a crisis, but they want to see, how about Africa? How do you help Africa to not get so affected by this economic crisis, but also to develop to a level whereby it can be part of the global economic system?
Now, Makori, this of course is the last day of the summit. South Africa is there, as we discussed yesterday. Is Mr. President Jacob Zuma expected to speak today, and what is his likely message?
Well, the likely message is that may the G20 leaders be more sensitive to African issues, the issue of poverty in Africa, the issue of climate change in Africa, the commitments that have been made by the IMF, the World Bank, the Western donors, that they should be fulfilled for the sake of the growth of the economies of Africa, and particularly for the elimination of poverty and the fighting of diseases such as HIV/AIDS.
And Makori, you know, I guess in your interactions there with some of the scholars, some of the activists who you've come across, you know, a lot of these concerns have been raised really over a significant period. In fact, at every summit, be it the G8, be it the UN, there are protesters demanding change. Do they really feel there's a wave of change coming, that something different can be expected?
Yeah, most of them say they do not expect any groundbreaking pronouncements or their messages to be acted upon immediately, but they're just hoping that they can keep chipping away, and with time, hopefully with more people voicing their concerns, the leaders can be sensitive and they can act on those demands.
Vincent Makori, so good to hear your report, and well, good luck on your way back here. We'll look forward to seeing you right back here in our studios on Monday.
Thank you very much, Ndemi.